October 23, 1943, 28,000 feet above the Dutch-German border. Hauptmann Joseph Wurmheller, commanding officer of the 3rd Staffel of Jagdgeschwader II, tracked a formation of B-17 bombers through his reflector sight. With 37 confirmed victories, Wurmheller represented the Luftwaffe's experienced elite. He had survived 2 years of combat over the Channel, France, and now the Reich itself. His tactical calculations that morning followed established doctrine, perfected through hundreds of engagements. The Focke-Wulf 190A5 beneath him carried two 13mm MG-131 machine guns in the cowling and two 20mm MG-151 cannons in the wing roots. His attack plan, refined through countless bomber interceptions, called for closing to between 200 and 300 yards before opening fire. At that range, his cannon shells would penetrate bomber armor with devastating effect. Beyond 400 yards, even the explosive 20mm rounds lost effectiveness, their trajectory dropping significantly and impact energy diminishing. What Wurmheller couldn't see were the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts, maintaining station 3,000 feet above the bomber formation. Major Gerald Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group had positioned his squadron precisely for this moment. Through his canopy, Johnson watched the German fighters begin their attack run, following the predictable pattern Luftwaffe doctrine prescribed. At 800 yards separation, a distance where German fighters posed no threat to American aircraft, Johnson rolled inverted and dove. His targeting solution accounted for the extended range. The P-47's 8 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns had been harmonized at 600 yards, creating a convergence pattern that remained effective beyond 800. At 700 yards, Johnson pressed the firing button. 8 guns erupted simultaneously, each firing at 800 rounds per minute. The combined theoretical rate of 6,400 rounds per minute sent a stream of armor-piercing incendiary ammunition downward through the cold air. Wurmheller's wingman, Unteroffizier Klaus Brettschneider, disintegrated. The Focke-Wulf didn't catch fire or spiral downward in a death spiral. At 700 yards away, concentrated 50 caliber fire had simply destroyed the aircraft's structural integrity. Wings separated from the fuselage. The engine tore free from its mounts. Brettschneider had no opportunity to bail out. One moment he flew in formation, the next he ceased to exist. Wurmheller broke hard left, abandoning his attack run. His combat report, preserved in Luftwaffe records, noted the impossible engagement range. American fighters opened fire at distances exceeding 700 meters with devastating effect. Our doctrine assumes safety beyond 400 meters. This assumption is no longer valid. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The shock rippling through Luftwaffe fighter units in autumn 1943 represented more than tactical surprise. German pilots had entered the war with absolute confidence in their understanding of aerial gunnery. That confidence rested on technical foundations established through careful testing and combat experience. The effective range of aircraft weapons had been defined by years of development and thousands of engagements. German fighter armament philosophy emphasized two primary weapons: the 13mm MG-131 machine gun, firing high-velocity ammunition at 900 rounds per minute per gun, provided reliable performance to approximately 400 yards. Beyond that distance, the relatively light projectile, weighing just 38 grams, lost velocity and accuracy rapidly. Crosswinds, target movement, and ballistic drop made hits improbable beyond 500 yards. The 20mm MG-151 cannon represented the Luftwaffe's primary fighter weapon. Firing explosive Minengeschoss shells weighing 92 grams at 850 meters per second at muzzle velocity, the cannon could destroy enemy aircraft with a single hit. However, the shell's relatively low velocity compared to solid projectiles meant significant drop at extended ranges. Luftwaffe gunnery training emphasized closing to between 200 and 300 yards before firing to ensure hit probability. This doctrine had proven effective throughout the war's early years. Against Royal Air Force Spitfires and Hurricanes, typically armed with 8 303 caliber machine guns, German fighters could safely approach an optimal firing range. The British rifle-caliber weapons, while numerous, lacked effective range beyond 400 yards. Their 7.7mm projectiles, weighing just 11 grams, became ineffective at extended distances. The Luftwaffe's gunnery doctrine incorporated hard-learned lessons from Spain, Poland, France, and the Battle of Britain. Pilots received extensive training in deflection shooting, learning to lead moving targets and account for projectile drop. The emphasis on marksmanship reflected ammunition scarcity. German fighters carried limited rounds. The Focke-Wulf 190A5 typically carried 550 rounds total for both cowl-mounted 13mm guns and 500 rounds combined for the two wing-mounted cannons. Every burst required careful consideration. Experienced pilots fired in short bursts of 1 to 2 seconds, conserving ammunition for multiple engagements. This discipline had become fundamental to Luftwaffe fighter culture. Precision over saturation, quality over quantity. The skilled pilot making every round count. American .50 caliber armament challenged. Every assumption underlying this doctrine. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun fired projectiles weighing 43 grams at 890 meters per second. The heavier bullet retained velocity and energy far better than lighter calibers. Where 13mm rounds lost effectiveness beyond 400 yards, 50 caliber projectiles remained lethal past 800 yards. The ballistic performance derived from basic physics. The 50 caliber's greater mass meant it retained momentum longer, resisting atmospheric drag more effectively than lighter projectiles. At 600 yards, a 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary round still carried sufficient energy to penetrate 20 millimeters of armor plate. At 800 yards, it retained enough power to destroy aircraft structural components. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who would survive the war with 301 confirmed victories, encountered P-47s for the first time in September 1943. His post-mission report documented the revelation. American fighters opened fire at ranges we considered safe. We observed tracers approaching from distances where return fire seemed pointless. Multiple aircraft hit before we closed to our own weapon range. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. The technical specifications revealed the disparity. A P-47C carried 2,800 rounds total, 350 rounds per gun across 8 weapons. Each armor-piercing incendiary round incorporated steel penetrators and incendiary compounds. In a typical 5-second burst, a P-47 could deliver approximately 530 rounds downrange, representing 51 pounds of metal and incendiary material. Critically, the 8-gun arrangement created overlapping fire patterns. While individual guns were harmonized to converge at specific ranges, typically between 400 and 600 yards, the pattern remained effective, beyond this convergence zone. At 800 yards, the 8 separate bullet streams created a cone of fire approximately 15 feet in diameter. Any aircraft intersecting this cone faced multiple hits. German test facilities eventually acquired damaged P-47 components for analysis. The Waffenamt technical assessment, dated November 1943, concluded that American .50 caliber weapons represented a paradigm shift in aerial gunnery. The report noted that traditional range assumptions no longer applied when facing multiple heavy machine guns with abundant ammunition supplies. Lieutenant Heinz Nock of Jagdgeschwader 11 recorded his first encounter with long-range P-47 fire in his diary, November 12, 1943, engaging bomber formation when an American escort appeared at extreme altitude. Tracers began striking my aircraft before I could identify the threat direction. Counted 17 holes in wings and fuselage, all hits from beyond what I judged to be 600 meters. Our intelligence briefings mentioned American heavy machine guns, but failed to convey the psychological impact of being hit at ranges where we cannot effectively return fire. The ammunition production supporting this firepower advantage demonstrated American industrial capacity. The Lake City Army Ammunition Plant in Independence, Missouri, had begun .50 caliber production in 1941. By 1943, the facility operated 24 hours daily, with 20,000 workers maintaining 3 shifts. Annual production reached 1.6 billion rounds, with quality control rejecting any cartridge varying more than 0.001 inch from specifications. Additional production facilities in Salt Lake City, St. Louis, Denver, and Twin Cities contributed billions more rounds. Combined American .50 caliber production exceeded 10 billion rounds throughout the war. This single caliber's production surpassed Germany's total aircraft ammunition production across all calibers. The logistics chain delivering this ammunition to combat units operated with corresponding efficiency. Transport ships carried millions of rounds from American ports to Britain continuously. Forward air bases in England maintained stockpiles sufficient for 30 days of maximum intensity operations. A typical P-47 group possessed reserves of 500,000 rounds, enough to reload every aircraft multiple times daily. German ammunition logistics operated under fundamentally different constraints. Chronic shortages meant fighter units received allocated quantities based on mission requirements. By late 1943, many Luftwaffe units operated on 3-day ammunition reserves. Pilots learned to conserve every round, often returning from missions with unfired ammunition to maintain unit reserves. Major Erich Hartmann, who would become the highest-scoring ace in history with 352 victories, developed tactics specifically accounting for ammunition scarcity. His philosophy, later articulated in post-war interviews, emphasized closing to point-blank range before firing. At 50 meters, even a 1-second burst from the Messerschmitt Bf 109G's single 30mm Mk108 cannon could destroy any aircraft. This extreme close-range doctrine minimized ammunition expenditure while maximizing kill probability. American pilots faced no such constraints. Abundant ammunition enabled different tactical approaches. Rather than conserving fire for optimal positioning, P-47 pilots could engage targets at extended ranges, firing ranging bursts to establish trajectory before closing. The 8-gun arrangement meant even suboptimal bursts often achieved hits through sheer volume of fire. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, developed tactics explicitly leveraging the .50 caliber's extended range. His Zemke fan formations spread squadrons wide, creating overlapping fields of fire that German fighters couldn't penetrate without exposing themselves to long-range American gunnery. The formation exploited the reality that P-47s could engage effectively at ranges where German fighters couldn't return fire. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group described the tactical advantage in his combat memoir. "We learned to open fire at 600 to 700 yards, walking our tracers onto the target as we closed. The Germans expected us to hold fire until optimal range. By engaging early, we disrupted their attack runs and forced defensive reactions before they reached effective range for their own weapons. The extended engagement envelope provided multiple advantages beyond pure firepower." German pilots planning attacks on bomber formations calculated approach vectors based on assumed American fighter capabilities. When P-47s began engaging at 800 yards, these calculations became invalid. Attack runs were disrupted before German fighters reached firing positions on bombers. Psychological effects compounded tactical disadvantages. Luftwaffe pilots who survived long-range P-47 attacks developed persistent anxiety about engagement distances they had previously considered safe. The traditional fighter pilot's spatial awareness, built on years of training emphasizing specific firing ranges, became unreliable when facing American heavy machine guns. Major Günter Rahl, third highest-scoring ace with 275 victories, provided crucial testimony about the psychological dimension. In a 1978 interview, Rahl stated, "The American .50 calibers changed our entire approach to combat. We had trained extensively on deflection shooting, learning precise firing solutions for specific ranges. When Americans began hitting us at distances we considered safe, our training became partially obsolete. We had to relearn combat at ranges where our own weapons were ineffective." The technical analysis of .50 caliber ballistics revealed why German expectations failed. At 800 yards, a standard armor-piercing incendiary round fired from a P-47, traveling at 400 miles per hour, retained approximately 60% of its muzzle energy. This provided sufficient power to penetrate aircraft aluminum skin, sever control cables, destroy hydraulic lines, and detonate fuel tanks. The incendiary component proved particularly effective at extended ranges. Each API round contained 3 grams of incendiary compound designed to ignite on impact with aluminum. At 800 yards, even non-catastrophic hits often started fires. Aircraft components struck by multiple rounds, even at extended range, frequently caught fire from accumulated incendiary effects. German aircraft construction philosophy emphasized weight reduction through minimal redundancy. Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt Bf 109 structures incorporated single-point load-bearing members. Damage to critical structural elements often resulted in catastrophic failure. American .50 caliber rounds, retaining significant energy at extended ranges, could sever these critical members. The contrast with German defensive armament was stark. Luftwaffe bombers typically carried 13mm MG-131 defensive guns. These weapons, effective against fighters closing to attack range, proved nearly useless against P-47s engaging from beyond 600 yards. German gunners found themselves helpless as American fighters fired from distances where return fire was ineffective. November 26, 1943, provided another demonstration during a raid on Bremen. P-47s of the 352nd Fighter Group engaged Messerschmitt Bf 110G twin-engine heavy fighters attempting to intercept the bomber stream. The Bf 110Gs, equipped with 21cm rocket mortars for bomber destruction, required stable flight for accurate rocket firing. Captain George Preddy, flying with the 352nd, engaged the Bf 110 formation at 750 yards, firing a sustained burst that destroyed 2 aircraft before closing to optimal range. His combat report noted, "The heavy fighters couldn't evade effectively at that range. By the time they recognized the threat and attempted defensive maneuvers, our fire had already damaged flight controls." The Luftwaffe's technical response attempted to address American firepower advantages through increased armament. The Focke-Wulf 190A7, introduced in December 1943, incorporated provisions for additional weapons. The A8 variant, entering service in March 1944, could mount additional 20mm or 30mm cannons in underwing pods. However, these modifications created new problems. The additional cannons, while increasing theoretical firepower, added weight and drag that severely degraded performance. The Focke-Wulf 190A8 with full armament weighed over 10,000 pounds, reducing speed by 30 miles per hour and climb rate by 20%. The performance penalty made heavily armed variants vulnerable to American fighters, which maintained superior speed and climb capabilities. More fundamentally, added German firepower didn't address the range disadvantage. The 30mm Mk108 cannon, devastating at close range, remained ineffective beyond 400 yards due to its low muzzle velocity of 540 meters per second and extreme projectile drop. No amount of additional short-range weapons could counter American fighters engaging effectively at 800 yards. By January 1944, Luftwaffe tactical doctrine incorporated explicit warnings about American long-range gunnery capabilities. Fighter commander briefings emphasized avoiding extended-range encounters with Thunderbolts. Pilots received instructions to break off attacks if P-47s engaged from beyond 500 meters, recognizing that closing range exposed German fighters to concentrated fire they couldn't effectively return. These defensive doctrinal changes represented admission of technical inferiority. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies through 1942, now operated under tactical constraints imposed by American firepower. Fighter units that had attacked at will were forced into defensive postures by aircraft armed with weapons effective at previously safe ranges. The production scales supporting American advantage grew throughout 1944. Republic Aviation's combined facilities in Farmingdale, New York and Evansville, Indiana, reached peak monthly production of 840 P-47s. Each aircraft received 8 Browning M2 guns, requiring over 6,700 new machine guns monthly for production aircraft alone, excluding training aircraft and replacement guns. Browning Arms Company's facilities in Hartford, Connecticut, along with subcontractors including General Motors, Colt, and Buffalo Arms, produced over 2 million M2 machine guns during the war. This single weapons systems production exceeded entire German aircraft weapon manufacturing across all types combined. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The quality control supporting this production maintained standards that German industry couldn't match. Each Browning M2 underwent function testing, firing proof loads exceeding normal operating pressures. Rejected guns were completely disassembled and rebuilt rather than adjusted. This stringent quality control meant P-47 pilots experienced virtually no weapon malfunctions in combat. German weapons, increasingly manufactured using forced labor in dispersed facilities operating under Allied bombing, suffered declining reliability. Luftwaffe pilots reported frequent gun failures, particularly with wing-mounted weapons exposed to extreme cold at altitude. The MG-151 cannon, while effective when functioning, experienced freezing problems above 25,000 feet that reduced reliability significantly. The ammunition technology itself revealed fundamental differences in industrial philosophy. American armor-piercing incendiary rounds incorporated tungsten carbide cores, providing exceptional penetration characteristics. The M8 API round could penetrate half an inch of face-hardened armor at 500 yards. At 800 yards, penetration capability remained sufficient to defeat any armor on German fighters. German 13mm armor-piercing rounds used steel cores with limited tungsten content due to strategic material shortages. By 1944, tungsten scarcity forced substitution of inferior materials, reducing penetration performance. The resulting ammunition couldn't match American .50 caliber effectiveness even at optimal ranges, creating a compounding disadvantage. The tracer component in American ammunition provided another advantage. Standard P-47 ammunition loading used a 4-to-1 ratio, 4 armor-piercing incendiary rounds, followed by 1 tracer. This created a visual effect where every fifth round glowed in flight, appearing as a continuous beam rather than individual projectiles. The tracer stream provided immediate feedback for aim correction, allowing pilots to walk fire onto targets at extended ranges. German tracer technology used different chemical compounds that burned less consistently. Luftwaffe pilots complained that tracers often burned out before reaching extended ranges, providing no aiming reference for long-range shots. This further disadvantaged German pilots attempting to engage at distances where American tracers remained clearly visible. March 19, 1944, during the first American raid on Berlin, demonstrated the cumulative effect of these advantages. The 8th Air Force launched over 600 heavy bombers, escorted by 800 fighters, including P-47s, P-38s, and the newly introduced P-51 Mustangs. Luftwaffe defenders faced overwhelming numbers, combined with American long-range firepower superiority. Oberstleutnant Egon Meyer, one of the Luftwaffe's most successful bomber-destroyers with 102 victories, was killed that day. Leading Jagdgeschwader 2 against the bomber stream, Meyer's Focke-Wulf 190 was hit by P-47 fire at extreme range. Witnesses reported he was struck while maneuvering to attack bombers, hit by American fighters engaging from distances exceeding 700 yards. He never reached his own weapon's effective range. Meyer's death symbolized the larger reality facing Luftwaffe fighter pilots in 1944. Experience and tactical skill couldn't compensate for fundamental firepower disadvantages. The Americans could engage effectively at ranges where German weapons remained useless, transforming every encounter into asymmetric combat, favoring overwhelming American advantages. The extended engagement range created cascading tactical problems for Luftwaffe formations. Traditional German attack tactics called for coordinated squadron-strength assaults on bomber formations, with fighters approaching from optimal angles to maximize deflection shots on bombers while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. These carefully choreographed attacks required specific positioning and timing, P-47s engaging at 800 yards disrupted German formations before they reached attack positions. The extended American firepower envelope meant escort fighters could intercept German attackers earlier in their approach, forcing defensive reactions that prevented coordinated attacks. Individual German fighters, forced into defensive maneuvers by long-range fire, couldn't execute the precise timing required for effective bomber attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gaby Gabreski, who would become the top P-47 ace in Europe with 28 victories, explained the tactical dynamic in post-war interviews. "We learned that our 50 calibers gave us an engagement range advantage of 300 to 400 yards over German fighters. We used this to disrupt their bomber attacks before they reached firing position. Even if we didn't score immediate kills, forcing them defensive at long range prevented effective attacks on the bombers." The bomber protection mission drove P-47 tactical development. While the aircraft's weight and size made it less maneuverable than German fighters in turning combat, the mission didn't require dogfighting. Maintaining stations near bomber formations and engaging German fighters at extended ranges suited the P-47's characteristics perfectly. German fighters attempting to reach bombers had to cross the protective envelope created by escorting P-47s. This envelope extended to 800 yards, within which concentrated 50 caliber fire made transit extremely hazardous. Luftwaffe pilots learned that approaching bombers meant accepting exposure to long-range American fire without ability to effectively return fire during the approach. The mathematics of this engagement geometry heavily favored defenders. P-47 pilots, maintaining position near bombers, could fire at German fighters approaching on predictable attack vectors. German pilots, focused on reaching bomber firing positions, often didn't see escort fighters until tracers began impacting their aircraft. By the time they recognized the threat and reacted defensively, they had already sustained damage from long-range fire. Major Walter Guler Oisau, with 123 victories and command of Jagdgeschwader 1, was killed on May 11, 1944, in combat with P-38s. While not P-47s specifically, his death illustrated the broader American firepower advantage. Oisau, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter leaders, was shot down by long-range fire while attempting to intercept bombers. His experience and tactical expertise proved insufficient against American fighters engaging at extended ranges with heavy weapons. The progressive elimination of experienced Luftwaffe leaders through 1944 created a compounding crisis. Each veteran pilot lost represented irreplaceable tactical knowledge and leadership. Replacement pilots, receiving abbreviated training due to fuel shortages and time pressures, lacked the experience to develop effective counter-tactics against American firepower advantages. By mid-1944, the average Luftwaffe fighter pilot arrived at operational units with approximately 60 hours total flight time, including less than 20 hours in fighters. Many had fired their guns only during brief qualification shoots. They faced American pilots with 200-plus hours of training, including extensive gunnery practice where they had expended thousands of practice rounds. This training disparity combined catastrophically with equipment disadvantages. Inexperienced German pilots, lacking the situational awareness developed through extensive training, often didn't recognize P-47 threats until actually under fire. The extended American engagement range meant these novice pilots were being hit at distances where their limited training provided no reference for effective response. American gunnery training incorporated extensive practice at various ranges. Pilots fired at towed targets from multiple angles and distances, learning to judge range and apply appropriate lead. By the time they reached combat units, American pilots had developed an instinctive understanding of ballistics at ranges from 200 to 800 yards. German training, abbreviated by fuel shortages, provided minimal actual gunnery practice. Pilots learned deflection shooting theory in classrooms, but had limited opportunity to develop practical skills. Many arrived at combat units having fired at aerial targets only 2 or 3 times. Their first extensive gunnery practice occurred in actual combat against opponents who had already mastered these skills through hundreds of training engagements. The P-47D variant, introduced in mid-1943, incorporated improvements that widened American advantages. The bubble canopy, replacing the earlier Razorback design, provided 360-degree visibility. Pilots could see threats from any angle, eliminating the blind spots that German fighters exploited against earlier American aircraft. The paddle blade propeller, introduced on the P-47D-23 in mid-1944, improved climb rate and altitude performance. Combined with water injection for the R2-800 engine, the system produced 2,530 horsepower for short periods, providing performance that German fighters couldn't match above 25,000 feet. At altitudes where bomber formations operated, typically between 25,000 and 30,000 feet, P-47s maintained full performance, while German fighters struggled. The Focke-Wulf 190A's BMW 801 radial engine lost significant power above 22,000 feet. The Messerschmitt Bf 109G's Daimler-Benz DB 605, even with methanol water injection, couldn't match American power at extreme altitudes. This altitude performance disparity, combined with extended firing range, created vertical combat zones where Americans dominated completely. P-47s maintained station above bomber formations, exploiting altitude advantage to engage German fighters climbing to attack altitude. The diving attacks from superior altitude, combined with long-range firepower, proved nearly impossible to counter. Hauptmann Heinrich Erler, commanding the second group of Jagdgeschwader 5 in Norway, encountered P-47s during operations against Arctic convoys. His combat reports documented the futility of engaging American fighters that could fire effectively from altitudes and ranges where German weapons remained useless. His unit suffered steady attrition to long-range American fire throughout late 1943 and 1944. Erler would survive the war with 209 victories, but his combat reports reveal the psychological toll of fighting at disadvantage. Repeated references to American firepower superiority and extended engagement ranges indicate deep concern about tactical situations where German fighters couldn't effectively engage opponents, inflicting steady losses. The ground attack role added another dimension to German trauma facing 50 caliber weapons. While air-to-air combat demonstrated extended range effectiveness, ground attack missions revealed the 50 caliber's destructive power against surface targets. A single P-47 could destroy locomotives, armored vehicles, and fortified positions that would require multiple German aircraft to eliminate. The armor-piercing incendiary ammunition that proved effective against aircraft at 800 yards could penetrate locomotive boilerplates, truck engine blocks, and light armor at even greater ranges. P-47s conducting armed reconnaissance missions would fire at targets from altitudes and ranges where ground-based return fire proved ineffective, systematically destroying German transportation infrastructure. D-Day, June 6, 1944, provided the ultimate demonstration. The 9th Air Force's P-47 groups flew over 2,000 sorties, creating an umbrella of firepower over the invasion beaches that German fighters couldn't penetrate. Luftwaffe units attempting to attack the invasion force found themselves engaged by American fighters at ranges where German weapons couldn't respond effectively. The few German aircraft reaching the invasion area were quickly destroyed by overlapping American firepower. P-47s, operating from forward airfields in England with minimal transit times, maintained continuous presence over Normandy. Any German aircraft detected faced immediate interception by fighters armed with weapons effective at ranges the Luftwaffe couldn't match. Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel, commanding German forces in France, referenced American air superiority in his reports to Berlin. While not specifically mentioning P-47 50 calibers, his assessments noted that Allied fighters made German troop movement impossible during daylight hours. The systematic destruction of German transportation by American aircraft armed with heavy machine guns paralyzed Wehrmacht operations. By late 1944, German fighter production actually peaked at over 2,000 aircraft monthly. However, chronic fuel shortages meant most never flew operationally. Those aircraft that did reach combat units faced overwhelming American numerical superiority, combined with technological advantages, including the extended range firepower that German pilots had learned to dread. The Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighters provided temporary relief from American firepower superiority through speed advantage. Jets could outrun P-47s in level flight, providing escape options when engaged. However, the Me-262's armament of four 30mm Mk108 cannons carried only 360 rounds total, approximately 100 rounds per gun, providing roughly 3 seconds of firing time. The heavy cannons proved devastating against bombers, but less effective against fighters due to extremely low muzzle velocity of 540 meters per second. The projectile's slow speed and extreme drop made deflection shooting at maneuvering targets extremely difficult. The limited ammunition meant that 262 pilots had essentially one firing pass before exhausting cannon ammunition. More critically, Me-262 aircraft remained vulnerable during takeoff and landing when speed advantage disappeared. Allied fighters, including P-47s, developed tactics of loitering near known jet bases, waiting for jets during vulnerable moments. Several irreplaceable German jet pilots were killed during landing approaches by American fighters, firing from ranges where the jets couldn't effectively return fire. The P-47M variant, though produced in limited numbers, represented the pinnacle of piston-engine fighter development. The R2 800-57C engine produced 2,800 horsepower with water injection, providing speeds exceeding 470 miles per hour. Only 130 were built, entering service in December 1944. The P-47N, designed for Pacific operations, carried 550 gallons of internal fuel. This single-seat fighter's fuel capacity exceeded that of German twin-engine bombers, demonstrating American industrial capability to build aircraft that defied conventional design constraints. The N variant could escort bombers to targets over 1,000 miles distant, ranges inconceivable in European theater design philosophy. Late-war P-47 variants incorporated the K-14 computing gun sight, a gyroscopic system automatically calculating deflection based on target range and movement. Pilots simply framed targets in the reticle and fired. The computer handled ballistics calculations, further democratizing gunnery by making even novice pilots effective marksmen when combined with 8 50 caliber guns. German fighters continued using simple reflector sights, requiring manual deflection estimation. Pilots calculated lead angles based on target speed, range, and angle, skills requiring extensive practice to master. The K-14 eliminated this requirement, providing accurate firing solutions automatically. Combined with extended 50 caliber range, the computing sight made P-47 gunnery nearly foolproof. Major Georg Peter Eder, who survived the war with 78 victories, provided post-war testimony about facing late-war American equipment. He noted that by 1945, American technological advantages had become so pronounced that tactical skill could barely influence engagement outcomes. Superior American equipment, particularly long-range heavy weapons combined with computing sights, created combat situations where German fighters were outmatched before firing began. The Strategic Bombing Survey conducted after Germany's surrender documented P-47 achievements comprehensively. The statistics revealed impact beyond tactical success. 3,752 enemy aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, 3,200 enemy aircraft destroyed on ground, 9,000 locomotives destroyed, 86,000 railway cars destroyed, 68,000 motor vehicles destroyed, and 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles destroyed. These numbers represented strategic paralysis of German military capability, transportation infrastructure destruction by P-47s, significantly reduced Wehrmacht mobility and logistics. The Luftwaffe's inability to counter P-47 operations meant American air power operated with near impunity throughout 1944 and 1945. Against these achievements, approximately 3,499 P-47s were lost to all causes, including 1,020 to enemy fighters, 2,479 to anti-aircraft fire, and operational losses. The exchange ratio in aerial combat exceeded 4-to-1, demonstrating clear American superiority throughout the aircraft's operational service. The pilot survival and rotation system contributed to American advantages. Pilots completing operational tours, initially 25 missions, later extended to 50, rotated home to train replacement pilots. This created continuous knowledge transfer where combat lessons informed training immediately. German pilots flew until killed, captured, or physically incapacitated, with no rotation system. By late 1944, most Luftwaffe pilots were inexperienced novices facing American veterans. The experience gap widened continuously, as veteran German pilots were progressively eliminated, while American units maintained corps of experienced leaders. This experience differential, combined with equipment advantages, created combat situations approaching systematic execution rather than equal contest. The psychological dimension of facing long-range American firepower cannot be overstated. Luftwaffe pilots who survived multiple encounters with P-47s developed lasting trauma responses. Post-war medical studies of German veterans identified what psychiatrists termed Thunderbolt neurosis, involuntary stress reactions to sounds resembling 8 synchronized machine guns. Veterans described persistent anxiety about engagement ranges they had been trained to consider safe. The fundamental collapse of doctrinal assumptions about weapon effectiveness created deep psychological stress. Pilots who had internalized specific tactical knowledge through years of training and combat found that knowledge suddenly obsolete when facing opponents who could kill effectively at ranges where German weapons remained useless. The broader German military learned harsh lessons about facing American industrial firepower. Wehrmacht officers who survived the war and later served in NATO emphasized that the P-47's 50 calibers had taught them modern warfare's fundamental nature. Industrial capacity to produce and sustain overwhelming firepower determined outcomes more than tactical excellence or individual skill. The collapse of German fighter defenses through 1944 directly enabled the strategic bombing campaign that destroyed German war production. Without effective fighter opposition, American bombers systematically eliminated German industrial capacity, including the synthetic fuel plants providing aviation gasoline. This created cascading failures where reduced fuel production meant reduced fighter training and operations, which enabled more effective bombing, further reducing fuel production. The P-47's role in achieving and maintaining air superiority over Europe proved strategically decisive. While P-51 Mustangs eventually assumed the long-range escort role due to superior range, P-47s provided the initial shield, allowing the bomber offensive to continue despite heavy losses in 1943. By the time P-51s arrived in numbers, P-47s had already broken Luftwaffe defensive capability. The aircraft's influence extended beyond World War II, establishing principles dominating modern air combat. Firepower superiority through volume of fire, standardization enabling mass production, and industrial capacity determining military capability became fundamental to American military doctrine. Modern fighters carrying rotary cannons firing 6,000 rounds per minute represent direct evolution of P-47 philosophy. When West Germany rebuilt its air force in the 1950s, it adopted American equipment, tactics, and doctrine. German pilots who had fought against American firepower now trained on American aircraft, firing American weapons, absorbing the industrial warfare philosophy that had defeated them. The student learned from the master, acknowledging that modern war belonged to nations capable of overwhelming material superiority. The human dimension behind statistics reveals profound lessons. Colonel Robert Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group survived a devastating attack on June 26, 1943, that put over 200 bullet holes in his P-47. The aircraft absorbed damage that would have destroyed any German fighter, bringing him home with damaged controls and shattered canopy. This legendary incident demonstrated P-47 durability, but also illustrated the cumulative effect of design philosophy, emphasizing survivability and abundance. German fighters, designed for minimum weight and maximum performance, incorporated minimal redundancy. Single critical component failures often resulted in catastrophic losses. American aircraft, built without extreme weight constraints, incorporated multiple redundant systems. This durability, combined with extended range firepower, created fundamental asymmetry in combat, where Americans could absorb damage and continue fighting while German aircraft were destroyed by relatively minor hits. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of the P-47's 50 caliber armament resonates through military history as demonstration of industrial democracy's triumph over totalitarian efficiency. Luftwaffe aces, despite superior training and early war experience, found themselves systematically defeated by overwhelming American material superiority. Symbolized perfectly by 8 machine guns, firing effectively at ranges German doctrine considered impossible. Every engagement reinforced the harsh reality that individual skill and tactical excellence couldn't overcome fundamental industrial disparities. The 50 caliber's extended effective range represented more than ballistic performance. It embodied American capacity to produce weapons of sufficient quality in unlimited quantities, supported by ammunition production and logistics that German industry couldn't approach. German pilots' surprise when American 50 calibers shredded Focke-Wulf 190s from 800 yards out represented their collision with modern warfare's true nature. They had prepared for individual combat between warriors and instead met industrial processing that destroyed them through mathematical certainty rather than martial prowess. The 8 guns firing in unison delivered not just bullets, but the message of inevitable defeat through material supremacy. The P-47 Thunderbolt's 50 caliber machine guns rewrote aerial warfare rules, establishing that victory belonged to nations capable of producing and sustaining overwhelming firepower. Luftwaffe aces learned this lesson in the most brutal way possible, through daily encounters with American fighters that could kill them at ranges they had been taught were completely safe. The surprise in their after-action reports transformed gradually into acceptance of military reality in the industrial age. In the end, 8 50 caliber machine guns firing from 800 yards out represented democracy's answer to fascism. Not through ideology, but through industrial mathematics that no amount of courage, skill, or tactical innovation could overcome. The German pilots who survived carried a permanent understanding that they had faced and been defeated by warfare's future, where production capacity and material abundance determined outcomes absolutely. The thunder of those 8 guns echoing across European skies announced not just American tactical victory, but the fundamental transformation of warfare itself, where industrial might prove decisive over martial tradition. That sound, once heard, could never be forgotten by those who survived to remember when they learned their entire understanding of combat had become obsolete at 800 yards range.